Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan has announced that government has sold a majority stake at South African Airways to Takatso Consortium. The consortium, owned by two prominent figures in business and aviation in South Africa, will own about 51%, while government will be left with the remaining 49%. The debate on whether to privatize SOEs has been a long-standing one. Entities such as SAA, Denel, the Post Office, Eskom and the SABC have been deemed by many as liabilities due to the millions that have been used to bail them out. So, should partial privatization be a strategy to avoid ailing, or to rather aid ailing state-owned entities? Let's unpack this for you. Joined now by financial news journalist Ray Mahlaka, as well as Director and Chief Economist at Econometrics. That's Dr. Azar Jammine. To both our guests, thanks for your time. Lovely to have you on the program. Dr. Jammine, I wonder if I can start with you. Does the proper corporatization, is the word I'm looking for, necessitate privatization even for SOEs?
I think in the context of the situation in which South Africa and our government finds themselves in terms of the inefficiency of SOEs over the last decade, the growing inefficiency and the growing cost to the fiscus, at a time when the overall situation of our fiscal position in South Africa has deteriorated massively, and this has had knock-on effects in all other kind of areas, including raising our interest rates to unnecessarily high levels. I believe that there is a lot to be said for partial privatization of these SOEs. Indeed, it was 4 years ago when I attended a seminar where the guest speaker was the head of Goldman Sachs internationally, a guy called Lloyd Blankfein, and he was asked about whether this was the way to go, and he said it's absolutely perfect. You don't have to privatize an entire SOE, but by partially privatizing it, you immediately increase the accountability of the management of the SOE to the new shareholders who are in it to make a financial gain. And secondly, it also results in an additional capital being injected to the SOEs at a time when they're desperately short of capital. And in this way, the government doesn't have to bear the financial burden of having to fund them at a time when it's running bigger and bigger budget deficits, and the public debt level of the country is rising to such an extent that we keep getting downgraded by credit ratings agencies, resulting in an increased perception of the possibility of a default on our debt down the line that forces long-term interest rates ever higher, at a huge cost to the fiscus, to the extent that debt servicing costs have now become the third highest area of government spending, ahead even of healthcare spending, and crowding out the ability of the government to spend on more critical social services.
Yeah. Ray, let's bring you into the conversation. As soon as people hear privatization, even partially so, there are concerns around that term, profits over people. How much of a worry do you think that should be once we start mulling a way forward about how to actually deal with SOEs in our country?
Yeah, you're correct, Ayanda. The P word, privatization, is a swear word, especially when it comes to trade unions. They hate privatization. But the announcement yesterday on SAA by Minister Gordhan is effectively an admission that the government does not have the skills, expertise to turn around the fortunes of SAA. But as Dr. Jammine said, privatization or partial privatization is not a bad thing at all, because effectively what it means is that there are parties that will inject money into an SOE, and with privatization it also brings skills into an SOE. But there are two problems here when it comes to privatization. The first is our SOEs, as you said, are bankrupt. They are, they're facing a really worrying financial crisis. And there is no business case for the private sector to invest in SOEs, because at the end of the day, the private sector wants returns on its investments. And unfortunately, our SOEs are in a really, worrying state. They have been used to grease patronage networks in recent years. And the second thing is privatization in South Africa. There's nothing new about it. It has been done before. Telkom is a perfect example. Back in 2003, Telkom was facing financial losses. In 7 years, Telkom had 5 CEOs, so just like SAA. But the government decided to give up control of Telkom, reducing its shareholding to about 40.5%. Today, Telkom has had quite stable leadership. It is profitable right now. So it really takes political will to get this done here.
Yeah. On that point, Ray, if I can stay with you. I mean, if it's about political will, then is it safe to say that there's nothing inherently bad or inherently good about privatizing or not privatizing? It's about how either of those things are actually carried out.
Indeed. And also, I go back to the point I said earlier on about, privatization in the SOE space is nothing new. 2 years ago, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni released a document on structural reforms. And in that document, he proposed that Eskom's power stations should be sold to the private sector because Eskom, the situation of Eskom we've seen this week is that the power system is unstable. It cannot generate enough revenue to service its debt, which is more than 400 billion rand. So what will make privatization possible is A, if trade unions buy into the idea of privatization, B, the government agrees to privatization, and C, the government not interfere as much in the operations of SOEs, which has been the catalyst of, the downfall of many SOEs in South Africa.
Right. Dr. Jammine, the critics, the naysayers are standing on the sidelines saying, if we're worried about corruption in the public sector, we should be very worried about corruption in the private sector. And there's a point to that, isn't it? Even though you try not to be cynical about what's actually taking place. The point is that whatever went wrong in the public sector could very well go wrong once you privatize those entities anyway.
You're absolutely correct that the private sector is not immune from criticism regarding its proclivity to be corrupt. But the first thing you've got to bear in mind is that corruption in the public sector has more or less become endemic, and many will argue that it is a function of the policy adopted by the ANC over the last 27 years of cadre deployment. That came through very, very clearly in President Ramaphosa's testimony to the Zondo Commission. And to have a private sector body coming in to oversee and the prevention of such corrupt practices, I think, is extremely important. It's an oversight of management. Yes, now that entity itself could be liable to be corrupt, but it will, in its own case, be subject to scrutiny from the outside world, who actually looks to see what the performance of this entity under new partial private ownership actually achieves. And that in itself should act as a very important check on corrupt practices by the new partial owners.
Right. Dr. Jammine, let me stay with you. It's also important to follow the terms of this privatization, whatever forms it takes, right? Because there's the issue of who owns the SOE, and there's also the very separate but related issue of who makes the decision around how the SOE is run. Help us ventilate those two different things and how we keep an eye on both these aspects, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. Now, what you're basically pointing out is that there is a difference between full privatization and partial privatization. And partial privatization is a mechanism through which one can allay the fears of those who believe that the private shareholders will simply operate the organization for profit at the expense of the people. Having the government take a majority stake, as is the case now with SAA, still gives the government an overriding veto over some of the decisions that might be taken by the private shareholders. And I think that is important for trade unionists, for example, in terms of protecting their interests. It's also important more generally for strategic interests that the government might have. In the case of SAA, for example, are there strategic interests as to why the airline should operate certain routes, international, regional, or domestic, as opposed to other routes? Those are important issues that cannot necessarily be given only to the private shareholders. The government itself has an interest. So it's I believe, a very workable combination of the best of both worlds, actually.
Right, that's very interesting. Ray, very quickly then, for a lot of people, again, part of the real fear around privatization is that you'll allow monopolies to develop, and before you know it, they are too strong, essentially. That's ironically part of the issue we're facing with Eskom. It's monopolized the sector so widely that having any kind of transition will be gradual and will take time. But to the point I'm trying to make, how do we ensure that the kind of privatization that does take place does not lead to monopolization of the affected sectors?
Well, the mandate of state-owned enterprises in South Africa is for them to, grow the economy, create jobs. So the mandate of state-owned enterprises is tied to the national agenda when it comes to development. In the case of SAA, just because the government is taking a minority position right now, it doesn't mean that the government won't have a say in how SAA is run going forward. I expect at least that the government will use its muscle and 49% shareholding to push through some of its job creation targets, and using the aviation industry to grow the economy. So the government will still have a voice. When it comes to BEE and procurement, I foresee the government will still have a voice and want SAA to still play a big role when it comes to economic development and human development as well, and empowerment in South Africa, which SOEs are quite central in their mandate. So even though SAA is going the partial privatization route, I still think the government will still use its muscle as a 49% shareholder to push through some of those transformation aspects.
Fascinating discussion as you watch muscles being flexed on all around. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Financial journalist Ray Mahlaka, as well as Director and Chief Economist at Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jammine.